Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about validity. And this is probably the first in 2 or 3 segments for this topic. I'm going to try to record the lecture notes for you in segments between 15 and 20 minutes each so that we don't wind up with any segments that are too long. It also makes the file sizes more manageable, I think, for people. So tonight we're going to start with the topic of validity. And really, validity is probably the most important topic in assessment, far more so than, say, reliability or even sort of some of the other technical characteristics of writing an assessment. Validity is concerned with the question of, are you measuring what you intended to measure? And nothing could be more basic than that. So here we go. We're going to start in, and I'm actually going to have you pause your video and do some notes right now. This is a principles question, and you say that your math or your English or science course teaches students to reason well mathematically or think using the scientific principle or to write well. What measurable evidence can you provide that it actually does so? So what I'd like you to do is actually pause this video right here and take some time to think about what it is that you could provide for measurable evidence that your students can in fact demonstrate those kinds of skills. Okay, so hopefully you've actually paused and you've thought about that. And as you thought about it, what did you come up with for a list? Did you come up with things like can answer different types of selected response questions, or that your students can solve problems? So when you say things like a student can solve a problem in mathematics, are you sure that the student actually understands the skill, or have they learned just by rote how to solve that type of a problem? The problem becomes even more apparent when we think about less tangible or less exact skills like good writing. So I'm sure a lot of you have read James Joyce. And if you've read Joyce, you know that it's not writing in the way that most middle school and high school English teachers demand good writing from their students. In fact, I suspect that James Joyce's writing would fail to meet the standard for most of our rubrics for writing in the state of Maine. And still, clearly, he is a talented author. So what I want to ask you the question is, what is it that we're measuring? Do we know what we're measuring? Do we really understand what it is that we're getting after when we think about creating a test? So it's easy to say, please write an essay on the causes of the Civil War. It's much harder to determine what actually constitutes a good essay. So, in validity, there are 3 key concepts in judging the quality of an assessment. First is validity, another is reliability, and third is usability. And tonight we're going to talk about validity, or the first part of validity actually. So why should we be bothered with these concepts? Why do we return to these kinds of things? Now, I know some of you have taken the undergraduate course, which covers similar content. We're going to really push in this course to challenge you to apply these concepts to your teaching, to your classrooms, to education. And for those of you out there that are not currently teaching, we're going to have the opportunity to collaborate through the online forums with other people who are currently educators. So why be bothered with these? All assessments contain error. I can't stress this point enough. As much as you try for your tests or your measures to be excellent reflections of real student performance, and whether they are pencil and paper, fill-in-the-blank kinds of tests, or these are authentic assessments where you're having students perform some sort of a task that's an approximation of what you want them to have learned. It doesn't matter what that task is. Every one of them contains a certain degree of error. And it's important for us to always be cognizant of what that error might be and what the sources of it might be. We also want to know that different kinds of assessments are prone to different kinds of errors. So, for example, many teachers that I've run into in my career teaching say that they prefer to use essay assessments because they can really understand what it is that a child knows. Well, in my former life as a special ed teacher, I had many young people that I tried to test them, and if I were to have them write an essay, I would get a very poor approximation of what that child might know. If I had them do a retelling to me, an oral retelling, I would get a much better description of what it was that they actually understood about the content. They couldn't write, but that was true before they started the content unit. It was still true after. So sometimes the method of our assessment gets in the way of actually revealing the true results that we're looking for. So what is it that we're measuring? So we want to learn how to build assessments that have less error and how to measure your error. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of thinking about assessment at a broad level is to better understand what is safe and what isn't safe for us to conclude from our assessments. You know, we see that school districts are making a lot of high-stakes sorts of decisions based on the pattern of results that they find in their assessments. And what I want to caution each of you, especially those of you that are going to be working as school leaders, is to understand what are the limits of the reliability and the usability of assessment data from sources like the Maine Educational Assessment, soon to be the New England Comprehensive Assessment. So it's very important, I think, for us to know what it is that it's safe to conclude and what it isn't safe to conclude from assessment results. I want to add a footnote here too in saying that some folks will say, you know, no assessment results are actually worthwhile, that tests don't measure anything important. And I couldn't argue more vehemently against that perspective also. What we find is that there is a strong relationship between students' ability or children's ability to perform on different kinds of assessment measures and their later performance in school and their later performance in college. They're actually very good predictors of kids' later success. In fact, they're as good a predictor, if not a better predictor, than the students' grades that they earn in school. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind a sense of balance as we're thinking about assessment results. Okay, and then finally, what kinds of assessments are there that we should not use in certain cases? So, I mean, to use a silly example, we certainly wouldn't create a true-false question when we were trying to understand students' deep reasoning skills around understanding the causes of the Civil War. It might be possible to write some true-false questions that got at a surface level at that concept, but chances are that's not really going to be what we want to really glean from listening to students' responses. This is the case where we want to have some sort of in-depth essay or story retelling or presentation or project, something that shows the ability of the student to synthesize these concepts. So when and where do we use particular kinds of assessments? Very important. So here's a definition for validity. It's the appropriateness of how scores are interpreted and used. That is, to what extent does your assessment measure what you say it measures? And is it as useful as you claim it is? Another way to put this is, to what extent are the interpretations and uses of a test justified by evidence about its meaning and its consequences? Validity is not a matter of whether or not a test is valid. Validity, as we'll see, is a matter of whether your inferences or your conclusions about that test are valid. And those are two very different things. We can give the same test and we could draw many different inferences about the student's performance or about the student's characteristics based on that test. But that doesn't mean that all of those different inferences are actually valid ones. So we'll explore that more here in the next few slides. Some very important points about validity. Validity is a matter of degree. It's not that something is valid, nor is it invalid, but rather, how valid is it? Some tests seem to be inherently valid. For example, If we were to have a calculation test where we ask students to add one digit by one digit numbers, there's very few of us that would argue that that's an invalid measure of students' ability to add one digit by one digit problems. However, if we were to give that same test and we were to infer from it that students were necessarily good at math in general, that might be an inappropriate assumption. Now, we'll find that at very early ages that assumption might be true. But as students get a little older, it may or may not be true that students who are very good at adding single-digit numbers quickly, that skill actually generalizes to talent in math in general, into, say, advanced mathematics. So what is the inference that we're drawing? How valid is that inference? It's always specific to a purpose as well. It's validity for proving a certain point. So no test is valid for all purposes, but tests can have valid interpretations for certain outcomes or certain purposes, depending on how well they're aligned to content and to the criterion that we have designed the test to serve. The third is that validity is a unitary concept, right? And we're going to look at some different kinds of evidence to help us make this one judgment of how valid is it. Fourth, we have to infer it. Now, you've heard me say infer about 20 times already in this little short segment. We can't directly measure the validity of something. We have to infer it. We have to make a guess about it. So, there are 4 interrelated kinds of evidence to help us to establish what validity might be. The first is content, the second is construct, the third is criterion, the fourth is consequential. We'll go through these each in turn. So, a couple of other points. What is it that are my learning objectives as I think about validity? Did my test actually address those particular objectives? Do my students' test scores really mean what I intended? What might have influenced their scores? Okay. Now, there are a lot of other things that might cause a student to have learned something other than perhaps your teaching. So it might have been just natural growth, it might have been your instruction, it might have been intelligence, or it might have been something more surreptitious like cheating. So sometimes we see changes in scores, but it's not always easy to attribute exactly why the students did better or worse over time. And then finally, did your testing have the intended effects? So I'm kind of backing up for a moment as we think about these, before we talk about these 4 areas, to think about these sort of guiding questions. And you might jot these down, or you have the slides so that you could print them out and have them separately as you think about this. So did my testing have its intended effects? What were the consequences of my testing process? Did the scores that I obtained have the degree of validity? Did they have the degree of importance or of interpretability that I intended them to have? Now, for example, if we think about the consequences of testing, one of the things that we found with the MEA was that there was a perception anyway that high school juniors were blowing off the main educational assessment. They knew that the test didn't count. They knew that the test didn't matter in terms of whether they graduated or whether their class rank. So there was a perception that students were not taking it seriously and therefore were blowing it off. Now, some of you may recall that in the not too distant past that the Maine Department of Ed required that students met the standards through a local assessment system, and part of that local assessment system were results from the MEA. And so it looked as though the MEA might actually become a high-stakes test. And what was interesting were the set of consequences of that decision or that perception, where we had a lot of schools in the state of Maine, when they found out that the MEA might actually be the gatekeeper for students actually getting their diplomas, really retooled in some cases a lot of their curriculum or retooled their test preparation so that students could do better on the MEA. That was an unintended consequence of the testing situation, of the assessment that was designed. It's just one small example. And we could go on and on about things like the decision to adopt the SAT, the decision to first have and then not have a local assessment system in the state of Maine. We could also go down to a classroom level, and we could say, do teachers who have end-of-unit exams that are comprehensive and require specific content knowledge, do their students prepare differently than teachers who don't have any kind of exams, and they base everything off homework and off group projects? So is there a difference in the way that students prepare? Most of us would say, sure, of course there is. Take this class for example. If I didn't have any requirement that you were to study for an exam, how many of you would prepare in the same way? You probably would not prepare in exactly the same way. So every decision that we make around how we assess students has a specific consequence or set of consequences that impact our students and our learners. So, thinking about content validity, one of the things that we want to talk about are outlining our achievement domain. So, what is the set or range of learning outcomes, the content, and the mental skills that you want your students to have mastered? In short, what is your set of instructional targets? So here's a definition for content-related evidence for validity. And that is the extent to which your assessment's tasks provide a relevant and representative sample of the domain of outcomes you intended to measure. You intended to measure is, I think, a key piece of this phrase. So simply because a test of yours has an entire section on the Civil War, and in fact you covered the Civil War in your unit of instruction, doesn't mean that your test actually reflects the instruction and the plan for what you wanted your students to learn. So if we think about the evidence, we think about what's the most useful type of validity evidence for a classroom test, okay? It's obvious, I think, when we ask a question about a certain topic that we've covered a particular piece of content. We define this domain by our learning objectives, and so it's fairly straightforward to say, okay, if we're going to study the Civil War, we're going to study about certain battles, we're going to study about certain generals, we're going to study about certain strategies, we're going to also study perhaps about certain justifications for each side for engaging in the conflict. And we could go on and on through that list of content areas that help us to define what is the domain of knowledge that we want students to have gained from our unit of instruction, and that's what we're going to assess. We choose these items, or we help to narrow these items down with a table of specifications. Okay, so the table of specifications looks usually something like this. So here we see we have Bloom's taxonomy, and for those of you that are not familiar with Bloom's, you should go ahead and Google that. You can look it up into Wikipedia, or you can take a look in your textbook. There's references in there too. But Bloom's essentially refers to the level of questions that we ask students. So here on the left we have knowledge and comprehension questions. Those are typically the easiest level or the lowest level of questions in terms of cognitive demand. The next is where we ask students to apply information. And the highest level, and you see here that they're grouped. This is just one example. There's not one right way to do a table of specifications. This is the general format that you're going to reproduce for this class for some of the activities that we're going to do, and then also for your final project. Notice here that we have more complex kinds of thinking skills. We've got analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So that's across the top. We see these different categories of cognitive demand. On the left side, notice that we've got different subject matter. So here, this is one about art history and art appreciation. And we see that they've got these very broad topics of art history, and they show the different questions that they've got at that level. And then they show art appreciation and the questions that they have for that level. Now, notice that art history is more heavily grounded in what? in knowledge and comprehension questions. That's not surprising. Whereas art appreciation has relatively few knowledge and comprehension or even application level questions, but has a greater emphasis on higher level questions. So again, going back to an earlier statement, the kinds of questions that we're going to ask should be reflective of the kinds of subject content and purposes that we're trying to serve. So here are some important points to remember. Content-related evidence is an attempt to build validity into the test rather than to assess it after the fact. So you're planning for what's going to be in your test, and you're planning for how that's going to line up with your instructional objectives. We find that our samples can be faulty in many ways. So here are a list of cautions. First of all, we can find that we have inappropriate vocabulary. Now, it might be tempting to put in some 25-cent words. So we could put in sesquipedalianistic, which means somebody who loves the use of foot-and-a-half long words, into a test. But unless that's been a specific vocabulary word we were working on, it's probably going to obfuscate what it is that you're trying to get at. And so we want to use appropriate vocabulary. That doesn't mean dumbing it down, but it means ensuring that the vocabulary that we did use or we do use in our test questions is reflective of the kind of language that we use in our instruction and doesn't differ radically. Second is unclear directions. And I'm guilty of this even now. As I do this course, I have students that say, well, I don't understand what you mean by those directions. Now, to us as teachers, when we write directions, we think, well, we know exactly what this means. We know exactly what it is that we wanted the students to do. But when the students look at it, they have a different interpretation of your directions. Omitting higher order thinking skills is a very common issue. So by making a blueprint like we looked at on the previous page, we can see if all of our questions are in fact knowledge level questions. Let's flip back for a moment. Well, if we look, if those questions were all equally weighted, we would see that in fact the total percentage of our items, the total number of items we see are, we have 9 in this case that are knowledge and comprehension. We have only 2 that are application, and notice that this is 14 through 20, so we have 9 again here. So we have a pretty good distribution, other than for this application level, of items for this test in terms of the representation of different levels of cognitive demand. So omitting higher order thinking skills isn't a mistake made on that previous blueprint, but it's certainly one that is very common in teacher-made tests. In fact, when I was doing a recent review of the literature for my own research, I found one study that had reviewed 1,200 different tests that were teacher-created. And of those 1,200, they found that less than 5% actually thoroughly assessed students at the highest levels of synthesis and evaluation. And that many of the tests, in fact more than 3/4 of those tests, only assess students at the knowledge and comprehension levels. So when I've done this course in the past, I've asked teachers that are currently practicing to take the chance and bring their test into class. What you might do is, if some of you are willing, to post your test or a sample of your test for us to take a look at to see to what extent do some of the measures that you've used, whether they're yours or maybe you borrow someone from another teacher, to what extent do those tests actually measure all of the different cognitive demand levels? So are they just knowledge and comprehension kinds of questions, or do in fact you get above that to application and synthesis and evaluation? The next caution here, item D, is that sometimes tests fail to reflect the content or the weight of what was actually taught. So here's a very common issue with teacher-made tests, is that the teacher will teach a 2 or 3 week unit, and they'll give a unit test at the end of that period of time. And what you find is that the last few days of class are most heavily emphasized on the test, and the first few days of class are almost not represented at all. So by using, again, a blueprint, you ensure that your test actually reflects the balance of instruction. That is, of course, if the balance of instruction is really what you intended for the students to learn. The next one, and this is perhaps less important, but if it's not present, I think it can throw students off, and that is the concept of face validity. And you see face validity in your textbook as well, but this is the superficial appearance or the label that you give to your test. If your face validity, if what your test looks like and how it presents doesn't match up with what it's supposed to be about, then that could be very problematic. For example, you might be able to come up with a very clever mathematics assignment that didn't look like a mathematics test at all. But that might be misleading for some of your students who were expecting a math-related test, and instead you've couched it in terms of science, or you've couched it in terms of social studies, or some other genre, or some other subject rather. That's not exactly fair. So face validity is an important component of making a good test, making sure that your students see a test that looks like what it's supposed to be about. And then the last point here on this page is that this assumes, of course, that your test administration and your scoring procedures were proper and were accurate. We're going to talk more about reliability and scoring procedures, but we find that scoring procedures are actually quite often inaccurate. So this is something that we'll treat in more detail. Now, the next topic is construct validity. We're actually going to pause here. We're going to end this video segment, and you're going to pick up part 2, which begins with construct validity.